After 15 years of combat operations, all I wanted was silence. The kind of quiet that does not come after explosions or gunfire, but the genuine peace of ordinary suburban life. Emma had stood by me through 3 deployments and countless nightmares. She deserved a home where sirens did not trigger my combat reflexes, where we could plant flowers that would live longer than a season. We found it in Meadowbrook Estates, streets named after flowers, lawns that looked like they were cut with surgical precision, and neighbors who smiled and waved from appropriate distances. The kind of place where nothing ever happened. That was the dream. That was what I thought we were buying. The realtor mentioned there was a homeowners association, but I did not think much of it. Rules meant order. Order meant peace. I had spent my entire adult life following orders, after all. How difficult could it be to keep a lawn mowed and trash cans out of sight? Emma fell in love with the garden immediately. She spent hours planning where each plant would go, which flowers would bloom in which seasons. I focused on the interior, building shelves, painting walls, doing all the things normal civilians do. Not once did I mention my background in the Navy SEALs. That part of my life was over. Captain James Sullivan was now just James Sullivan, retired and ordinary. The first letter arrived 3 weeks after we moved in. Notice of violation. Flagpole height exceeds regulation. I measured it. Exactly as specified in the guidelines they had given us at closing. Exactly. I called the number listed and spoke to a woman named Judith Harrington, HOA Vice President. The measurement is taken from the ground to the tip of any ornament on the pole, she explained in a tone one might use with a small child. Your eagle ornament puts you 3 inches over regulation. I removed the eagle. Problem solved, I thought. The second notice came a week later. Mailbox design non-conforming. We had the same mailbox as everyone else on the street. When I pointed this out to Judith, she explained that ours was apparently an unauthorized shade of black. I repainted it. You do not need to make waves, Emma told me, her hand gentle on my shoulder. We are the new people here. We should try to fit in. Emma was like that, eager to please, quick to smooth over conflict. I ignored the warning signs. I spent my days working at the local hardware store, doing small construction jobs, living like any other civilian. Emma spent her days making our house into a home. But something was happening when I was not there. Emma's enthusiasm for greeting neighbors dimmed. She jumped when the doorbell rang. She checked through the peephole before answering every time. One evening, I found her sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a piece of paper. When she saw me, she quickly crumpled it and tossed it toward the trash. It missed, landing on the floor. She rushed to pick it up, but I was faster. "What is this?" I asked, smoothing out the crumpled notice. "Nothing," she said quickly. "Just another HOA thing. I will take care of it." The notice cited us for unapproved garden stake height and included a $75 fine. But it was not the citation that concerned me. It was the handwritten note at the bottom. "Third violation this month. Perhaps your husband should spend less time at work and more time learning the rules." I looked at Emma's face and saw it then, the strain around her eyes, the forced smile. "How many of these have there been?" I asked. "It is not important," she said. "It is just part of living here." But I could sense it was more than that. Something was happening in our perfect neighborhood, and it was happening to my wife. The violations accelerated after that, each one more absurd than the last. Improper flower arrangement, plants must be grouped by species. Unapproved outdoor lighting, lumens exceed nighttime standards. Decorative rock placement creates non-uniform landscape appearance. I began keeping every notice, creating a file. The pattern was clear: Most arrived while I was at work. Emma tried to handle them quietly, but I could see the toll it was taking. Her garden, once her sanctuary, became a source of anxiety. "They just stood there watching me garden yesterday," she told me one evening, her voice barely above a whisper. "This woman Judith and a tall man named Kyle. They took pictures of every plant I put in the ground, then told me the spacing was wrong." I decided to attend the next HOA meeting. The community center was filled with neighbors sitting in neat rows, faces expressionless. Judith sat at the center table, flanked by 4 other board members including Kyle, a man with cold eyes and a permanent scowl. When the floor opened for resident concerns, I raised my hand. "My name is James Sullivan," I said, standing. "My wife and I have received 17 violation notices in 2 months, most for infractions that do not appear in the written guidelines we were given." Judith looked down at her papers, not meeting my eyes. "All violations are documented according to bylaw standards," she said mechanically. "If you have specific questions about specific violations, you can schedule a personal review session." "I am questioning the validity of all 17, I responded, "and I am asking to see the specific guidelines that we have violated." Kyle leaned forward. "Mr. Sullivan, this is not the forum for personal grievances. The meeting has an agenda that must be followed. Perhaps if you had arrived on time, you would understand the process better." Several neighbors nodded in agreement. Others looked down, avoiding eye contact. I recognized the technique immediately: public humiliation to enforce compliance. I had seen it used in military training, but this was not the military. This was supposed to be home. "Thank you for your input," Judith said, dismissing me with a wave. "Next item on the agenda." I sat down, anger building. Emma squeezed my hand under the table. "It is fine," she whispered. "Let it go." But I could not let it go, especially after what I discovered that weekend. I had installed security cameras on our property, discreetly, following all legal guidelines. Reviewing the footage from that week, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Judith and Kyle entering our property while we were both out, moving potted plants, adjusting the garden lights, taking photographs, creating violations where none existed. I showed Emma the footage that evening. Her hands trembled as she watched. "Why would they do this?" she asked. "What did we do to them?" "Some people need to control others," I said. "It has nothing to do with us." The next day, I was in the front yard when Judith appeared, clipboard in hand. "Your sprinkler system is running outside approved hours," she said without greeting. "The sprinklers are not even on," I replied calmly. "They were on earlier. I have photos." She held up her phone. "That will be $100 fine." "I would like to see the photos time-stamped and dated," I said. "And I would like to know why you entered our property yesterday without permission." Her eyes narrowed. "You should control your wife better," she said, voice dripping with contempt. "She plants whatever she wants wherever she wants. This neighborhood has standards." "Do not speak about my wife," I said quietly, "and do not enter our property again without permission." She smirked. "Or what? Maybe focus less on cameras and more on compliance, Mr. Sullivan, or whatever your real title is." That evening, an unmarked envelope appeared in our mailbox. Inside was a single sheet of paper with typed text. "A SEAL knows how to follow orders right. Civilian life must be so difficult for someone used to being important." I had never told anyone in the neighborhood about my military background, not a single person. I stared at the letter, feeling something shift inside me. The part of me I had tried to leave behind, the strategist, the tactician, was waking up. The bruise appeared on a Tuesday. I had gone to pick up supplies from the hardware store, leaving Emma alone for less than an hour. When I returned, she was sitting at the kitchen table, right hand wrapped in a dish towel filled with ice. "What happened?" I asked, setting down the bags. "Nothing," she said quickly. I slipped near the garden bed, hit my wrist on the edge of the stone border. I gently took her hand, unwrapping the towel. The bruise was darkening already, purplish marks that looked distinctly like fingerprints, not the kind of bruise you get from falling. "Emma," I said softly, "please tell me what really happened." She looked away. "It does not matter, I do not want trouble." I did not push. 15 years of marriage had taught me when Emma needed space. But later that night, while she slept, I sat in the living room going through the security footage. The cameras had not captured the front garden bed at the right angle. Whatever had happened was just out of frame. The next morning, I was checking the mail when our neighbor Mrs. Ellison approached. She was in her 70s, quiet, always tending to her bird feeders. She looked around nervously before speaking. "I saw what happened yesterday," she said, voice barely audible. "With your wife." I stilled. "What did you see, Mrs. Ellison?" "They came to your door. That woman Judith and the tall man, Kyle. Your wife answered. They were delivering some kind of notice. I could not hear everything, but they were shouting about your front garden rocks." She paused, wringing her hands. "Your wife tried to close the door. The man put his foot in the way, then he pushed the door open. Your wife stumbled backward. The woman grabbed her wrist when she tried to step back inside. They were yelling at her. I wanted to help, but—" Her voice trailed off. "Thank you for telling me," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the rage building inside me. That afternoon, I pulled out the HOA charter and bylaws, reading every line of every page. Nowhere did it state that HOA representatives had the right to physically enter a home without permission. Nowhere did it give them authority to touch residents or force compliance. I drove to the police station. Officer Mendez listened to my story with a sympathetic expression. "Do you have video of the assault?" he asked. "No," I admitted. "It happened just outside the range of our cameras." He sighed. "Without evidence, this becomes a he said, she said situation. And technically, HOA disputes are civil matters, not criminal." "Physical assault is criminal," I countered. "Without evidence or your wife's willingness to press charges, there is not much we can do," he explained. "Is she willing to make a statement?" I knew the answer before I asked Emma. She was terrified of escalating the situation, terrified of becoming a larger target. That night I sat alone in our darkened living room, staring out at the perfect lawns and identical houses. In the shadows, I allowed myself to remember, to recall the man I had been, the skills I had developed, the operations I had planned and executed, the way I had been trained to observe, to plan, to act. I remembered how to identify vulnerabilities, how to evaluate threats, how to neutralize hostile forces without ever firing a shot. I thought about Emma's bruised wrist, about Mrs. Ellison's fearful eyes, about the other neighbors who never spoke up at meetings, who looked away when confronted. This was not a war zone. These were not enemy combatants. This was a suburban neighborhood with people drunk on petty power, but the principles remained the same. Intelligence gathering, strategic planning, tactical patience. I had spent years learning how to dismantle systems designed to hurt people. I had spent years protecting those who could not protect themselves. I had been playing by their rules. It was time to change the game. At dawn, I began my surveillance, not with military equipment but with tools any civilian could purchase. trail cameras disguised as birdhouses, audio recorders hidden in garden ornaments, motion sensors that would alert my phone when anyone approached our property line. I established patterns. Judith patrolled on Tuesdays and Fridays, always between 10:00 a.m. and noon. Kyle preferred afternoons, especially when people were likely to be at work. They traveled together when delivering fines or confronting residents directly. I mapped their routes, the houses they targeted most frequently, the residents who received the most violations versus those who seemed immune. I noted which board members lived in which houses, which properties never received citations. I kept all of this from Emma. She was still recovering from their assault, still flinching at unexpected sounds. I wanted her to feel safe again before involving her in what was coming. 3 weeks into my surveillance, I had enough data to identify patterns. They targeted newer residents most aggressively. They focused on households where one spouse was frequently absent. They escalated violations against anyone who questioned their authority. I began reaching out to neighbors, not overtly but through casual conversations, at the mailbox, while mowing the lawn, during walks around the neighborhood. "Noticed you got a violation last week," I would say casually. "We have been getting them too." Most people would tense, change the subject, but some would nod, share their own stories. Mrs. Ellison was not the only one who had witnessed intimidation. The Thompsons had paid over $2,000 in fines for infractions they swore they never committed. The Garcias had been threatened with a lien on their home over unapproved window treatments. I began sharing small cameras with neighbors who trusted me, teaching them how to position them, how to save footage, how to document everything. The evidence accumulated quickly. Judith and Kyle entering backyards without permission, moving items to create violations, laughing as they wrote up citations, discussing their problem residents by name. Then came the warning. A formal letter from the HOA board claiming I was in violation of community surveillance laws and demanding I remove all cameras from my property immediately or face significant fines. I knew the law better than they did. In our state, homeowners had the right to install security systems on their own property. The cameras did not violate any privacy statutes as long as they were not pointed directly into neighboring homes. I did not remove the cameras. Instead, I added more, smaller, better concealed. I began carrying a voice recorder whenever I was outside. I documented every interaction, every conversation, every hint of their methods and motivations. Emma noticed my focus, my quiet determination. She did not ask questions, but sometimes I would catch her watching me with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Do you trust me?" I asked her one evening. "With my life," she answered without hesitation. "Then trust me now," I said. "Things are going to change, but I need time." Tactical patience, the ability to wait for precisely the right moment to act, to gather intelligence until you have not just enough to move, but enough to win decisively. That was what I had been trained to do. That was what I was doing now. And when Judith and Kyle came to our door again, citation in hand for unauthorized surveillance equipment, I was ready. I had exactly what I needed. Intelligence without action is pointless. I had collected enough evidence to paint a complete picture of systematic harassment, intimidation, and abuse of power. Now it was time to use it. I researched local journalists, looking for someone with a history of covering community issues and corruption. Nina Carver had written an exposé on city council kickbacks the previous year. She had a reputation for thoroughness and fearlessness. I created an anonymous email account and reached out to her, providing a brief summary of what was happening in Meadowbrook Estates. No details yet, just enough to gauge her interest. She responded within hours. I have heard complaints about predatory HOAs before. If you have evidence, I would like to see it. I prepared the files meticulously. Video clips showing Judith and Kyle trespassing on multiple properties. Audio recordings of them discussing how to make examples of residents who questioned them. Spreadsheets documenting the pattern of targeted harassment. Statements from neighbors who had suffered similar treatment. I sent everything to Nina from a public computer at the library, using the pseudonym Concerned Resident. I included a detailed timeline and contact information for neighbors who had agreed to speak with her. 3 days later, an article appeared on her blog, Predatory Practices, MEADOWBROOK HOA accused of systematic harassment. The effect was immediate. Neighbors began talking to each other, first in whispers, then more openly. People who had remained silent for years suddenly found their voices. The article was shared in community groups on local social media pages. Nina published a follow-up piece 2 days later, featuring interviews with 5 different households. The story was gaining traction. Local television news picked it up. People began driving by our neighborhood, slowing down to look at the perfect houses hiding not-so-perfect stories. Then came the confrontation I had been anticipating. Judith and Kyle appeared at our front door, faces flushed with anger. "You are behind this," Judith hissed. "You have been spreading lies about the HOA." "We have documentation of every violation," Kyle added. "We will sue you for defamation." I did not hide this time. I held up my phone openly, recording their every word. "Please continue," I said calmly. "I would like to hear more about these lawsuits you are planning." They noticed the phone. Kyle's face darkened. "You cannot record us without permission." "Actually, in this state, single-party consent is all that is required," I replied. "And I consent to recording this conversation on my own property." The front door opened behind me. Emma stepped out, her eyes clear and focused. She glanced at my phone, then at Judith and Kyle. Something shifted in her expression, the fear replaced by something stronger. "I think you should leave now," she said, her voice steady. "Unless you would like to explain on camera why you pushed your way into our home and grabbed my wrist hard enough to leave bruises." Judith's mouth opened, then closed. Kyle took a step back. "This is not over," Judith said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Actually," I replied, "it is just beginning." As they retreated down our driveway, Emma turned to me. "You have been fighting back all this time." It was not a question. I nodded. "Why did you not tell me?" she asked. "I wanted you to feel safe first," I said. "I wanted you to heal." She smiled then, the first genuine smile I had seen in months. "You move like a soldier," she said softly, "even when you think no one is watching." The snowball effect was swift and merciless. Nina's articles were picked up by larger news outlets. A local television station ran a segment titled HOA Harassment, When Community Rules Become Community Tyranny. The HOA board called an emergency meeting. The community center was packed, standing room only. Residents who had never spoken at meetings before came armed with their own stories, their own evidence. Kyle was noticeably absent. A terse announcement from the board president stated he had been suspended pending internal review of recent allegations. Judith sat at the table, her expression stony, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. "We take these accusations very seriously," the board president, a man named Richard Morton, said to the crowd. But we must caution against a rush to judgment based on out-of-context information or misunderstandings. The room erupted. One by one, residents stood and shared their experiences. The Garcia family described how Judith had threatened to put a lien on their house over unapproved curtains. The Thompsons detailed thousands in fines for violations that mysteriously appeared and disappeared. Mrs. Ellison, voice shaking but determined, described witnessing the assault on Emma. "I was afraid to speak up," she said. "I have lived here for 20 years and I was afraid in my own neighborhood." Her words hung in the air, heavy with shared recognition. The next day, Judith resigned from the board. Her resignation letter cited personal reasons and health concerns. Everyone knew the truth. Cameras began appearing everywhere, not hidden now but prominently displayed. Doorbell cameras, security systems, signs reading video recording in progress sprouted like new flowers. The message was clear: we are watching you now. At the next regular HOA meeting, Richard Morton attempted damage control. "We understand there have been concerns about enforcement practices," he began. "The board wants to assure all residents that we are committed to transparency and fairness moving forward." The crowd responded with skeptical murmurs. Someone called out, "Will you be refunding the unjust fines?" Morton looked uncomfortable. "We are reviewing all financial matters and will address any discrepancies." "My wife was physically assaulted on our property," I interrupted, standing. "That goes beyond discrepancies." Morton looked directly at me for the first time. "Mr. Sullivan, we deeply regret any misconduct by former board members, but we must move forward constructively." Emma stood then. I had not expected this. She walked to the front of the room, her steps steady. "My name is Emma Sullivan," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "For weeks ago, 2 HOA representatives pushed their way into my home and physically grabbed me when I tried to close my door. My wrist was bruised for 10 days. She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of her neighbors. "I did not speak up because I was afraid. I did not want to cause trouble. I wanted to be a good neighbor." Her voice grew stronger. "But being a good neighbor does not mean accepting abuse. It does not mean watching others be mistreated and staying silent. It means standing together against people who use power to hurt others." Tears glistened in her eyes, but her voice never wavered. "I am not afraid anymore." The room was completely silent when she finished. Then slowly people began to stand, one by one, a silent affirmation, a promise. I remained seated in the back, watching as the system that had terrorized my wife collapsed from within. No tactical strikes needed, no complex operations, just the truth, finally exposed to light. Spring came to Meadowbrook Estates with more than just new flowers. A completely restructured HOA board took office, elected by the highest resident turnout in neighborhood history. The new board's first action was to review and revise the bylaws, simplifying rules, establishing clear enforcement procedures, and creating a resident oversight committee. Security cameras were no longer prohibited, but regulated under reasonable guidelines. Residents had the right to be present during any violation assessment. All fines required photographic evidence and written explanation of the specific bylaw violated. Most importantly, HOA representatives were explicitly banned from entering private property without permission or making physical contact with residents under any circumstances. Emma and I sat on our porch swing watching the neighborhood transform, not in its physical appearance. The lawns were still manicured, the houses still well-maintained, but there was a different feeling now. People waved more genuinely, stopped to chat, shared plants and gardening tips. "I need to tell you something," I said to Emma as the sunset painted our perfect street in gold. "Something I should have told you long ago." "About your time as a SEAL?" she asked softly. I looked at her in surprise. She smiled. "I always knew," she said. "The way you scan a room when you enter it, the way you position yourself with your back to walls, the nightmares you never talk about. Why did you never say anything?" "Because you wanted to leave that part of you behind," she said simply, "and I respected that. But James," she took my hand, "it is part of who you are, the training, the discipline, the protective instinct. Those things do not disappear just because you take off the uniform." She was right. For years I had tried to bury Captain Sullivan beneath lawn care and home repairs. I had tried to be just James, ordinary civilian. But when Emma needed me, when our home was threatened, it was the soldier who knew what to do. "I thought civilian life meant leaving everything behind," I admitted. "I thought peace meant forgetting." "Peace is not the absence of conflict," Emma said. "It is having the strength to face conflict with clarity and purpose." The next morning, we worked in the garden together. Emma planted lilies along the front walkway, bright orange ones she had kept hidden in the shed all year, afraid they would be deemed too vibrant for neighborhood standards. "I think I will plant sunflowers next," she said, patting the soil around a bulb. "The really tall ones that face the sun." Our neighbor Mrs. Ellison called a greeting from across the street. The Garcia's children rode bicycles on the sidewalk. The Thompsons were building a treehouse in full view of everyone. No permission slips, no variance requests, just a father and son creating something together. This was the peace I had sought all along. Not the sterile quiet of enforced conformity, but the genuine harmony of a community where people felt safe to be themselves. I had fought many battles in my military career, missions across deserts and mountains, through jungles and villages. But this one, this quiet war for our home, had changed me in ways those never did. Because this time I was not fighting for a flag or a strategic objective. I was fighting for something more fundamental, the right to live without fear in my own home. Real peace is never given. It is earned through vigilance, courage, and sometimes strategic action. It requires not just the absence of conflict, but the presence of justice. And as I watched Emma plant her bright, rebellious flowers, I knew we had finally found it. Not the artificial peace of silent suffering, but the earned peace of standing together against those who would use power to harm others. That is a battle worth fighting. That is a peace worth protecting.